I've been thinking about something recently, and I think you had this feeling too. Sometimes we look at the way we live today, and we can't really point one specific thing that's wrong with it, because when you look at the individual things we're doing, most of them actually seem pretty reasonable. We work, we make money, we want to travel, and none of these things seem like bad things to want. And I've been thinking about this for a while. And at first I thought maybe the problem is simply that we work too much. Because obviously a huge part of the modern life revolves around work and making money. And there are definitely people who spend so much of their lives working that they barely have any time left for anything else. But then I started thinking, well, wait a second. I don't actually think that work itself is the problem. Because work can be a really good thing. Like, imagine you have a family. You want to work hard because you want to provide for them. Obviously, there's something good in that. And even if you don't have a family, right? There's something good about maybe developing a skill or becoming good at something. So, if work itself can be good and money can be good, then what exactly is the problem? And I think I've started to understand it a little differently now. Maybe the problem isn't that we value the wrong things. Maybe the problem is that we've put the right things in the wrong order. And I think that sounds like a small distinction at first, but if you actually follow the idea, it becomes pretty important. Because obviously, not everything that's good, it's good in the same exact way. Money is good, work is good, beauty is good, but I don't think we would say all of these things are equally important. And that's where I think the idea of hierarchy of values rather, becomes really interesting. So take money for instance. There's obviously nothing wrong with making money. We need money to live, right? And having money gives you a certain amount of security and freedom. And it allows you to provide for yourself and other people. But if you think about it, money is valuable because of what it allows you to do. If I somehow had $1 million, but I wasn't allowed to use it for anything, then having that $1 million wouldn't really accomplish much, right? So money is what you could call an instrumental good. It's valuable because it helps you obtain something else. And once I started thinking about that, I started asking myself whether the same thing applies to work. What is work actually for? Well, you work to make money. But then what is money for? You use it to provide for yourself, to have a certain, let's say, standard of living, to take care of your family and so on. Okay, so then what are those things for? And if you keep following that question, eventually you have to arrive somewhere where you can't just keep saying, well, this is valuable because it gives me something else. At some point there has to be something that we actually want for its own sake. And this is where I think modern society starts to become a little strange. Because we're incredibly good at pursuing means, but I'm not sure we're equally good at explaining what the ends are. We know how to make money, we know how to become more productive, advance our careers, but what exactly are all of these things ultimately supposed to give us? And I think that's where something starts going wrong. Because you can very easily start working in order to have a good life, right? And then a good life becomes defined by the things that your work gives you. And then you need to work more in order to maintain those things. And suddenly, without ever consciously deciding, you've gone from working so that you can live to basically living in a way that allows you to keep working. And I'm not saying this is everyone's life, obviously, but I think most of us can recognize some version of that. And this is when I started wondering whether the problem isn't really how much we work, but what our work is subordinate to. Because if work is serving something higher than itself, then working hard isn't necessarily a problem at all. But if work becomes one of the highest things in your hierarchy of values, then even though work itself is good, you're giving it a position that was never supposed to have. And to support this idea, I want to share something that happened to me this summer that made me think about this. So what happened was that this year I visited a historical city somewhere in Europe, and while I was there, I went into this really beautiful church. It had originally been Catholic, but later became Lutheran, and it was open to visitors, so I could go inside and have a look around. But they were still holding services there. And I happened to be there around midday, and there was this short service going on, maybe 15 minutes or so. Basically, the idea was that people would stop whatever they were doing, come to the church, and give glory to God. And I remember thinking, that's actually a really interesting concept, because think about what's happening here. It's the middle of the day, people have to do things, right? They have to work, they have responsibilities, all the ordinary things that need to be taken care of. And they're basically being told, okay, stop for 15 minutes. And I found that really interesting because it wasn't really saying that work is bad. It wasn't saying that responsibilities were unimportant, but rather it was saying that there is something more important than what you're doing right now. And I remember thinking that maybe this is actually the point of the whole thing. Maybe those 15 minutes aren't really taking something away from your life. Maybe they're actually putting the rest of your life into context. Because you're being reminded that yes, you have to work. Of course, you have responsibilities. You have things to accomplish. But all of these things exist within a much larger picture. And honestly, I found that quite beautiful. Because I think one of the strange things about modern life is that we're constantly moving from one thing to the next, and there isn't really anything in the structure of our lives that necessarily tells us stop and ask, okay, but what is all of this actually for? And I'm not saying that everyone needs to go to church at midday for 15 minutes, although I don't think that's such a bad idea. What I'm interested in is the principle, right? The principle behind it, hence the name of the channel. The principle that there should be something above the daily struggle. And I think that's something we've lost to some degree in our society today. Not necessarily just the religious practice, but the idea that life has an order and that some things are supposed to be higher than other things. So yeah, at this point I started again questioning my own argument, because I don't want to turn this into one of those arguments where everything about modern society is terrible and everything in the past was somehow perfect. That's obviously not true. People in the past were had incredibly difficult lives. They worked extremely hard, they had their own problems, and certainly they didn't all have some perfectly ordered hierarchy of values. And modern society has also given us a lot of things that are genuinely good, right? We have technology that makes our lives easier on one hand. On the other hand, it might make our lives harder. But overall, there are some benefits. So I don't think the answer is simply that modern society is bad. I think there's something more specific going on. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that we've become extremely good at answering the question how, while becoming much less comfortable answering the question why. How can I make more money, become more productive, or advance my career? Those are all perfectly reasonable questions, but notice that none of them actually tell you whether the thing you're pursuing is worth pursuing in the first place. And this is the thing I noticed about our society. We are unable to think about the why question anymore. We are so good at optimizing everything for the how question that when somebody starts to ask, why are we doing all of these things? These people start to look at you differently, let's say. I remember I was reading about ancient Greece and how having time to philosophize, which by the way, that meant thinking a lot about the why question, was considered a virtue. People were having free time to think, and that was considered virtuous. Think about the stark difference here with our modern society. It's night and day. Productivity is now the highest value. But productivity can tell you how efficiently you're doing something, but it can't tell you whether that thing deserves your time. Money can give you more options, but it can't tell you which options are actually worth choosing. And I think this is where the connection with the modern crisis of meaning is really interesting, because maybe people don't necessarily have too few means. Maybe they have too few ends. We have all of these things that are supposed to help us build a good life, but we're not always very clear about what the good life actually is. Maybe it's having free time to philosophize. And if you don't know what you're ultimately trying to achieve, then becoming more efficient doesn't necessarily solve the problem. You might just become more efficient at moving in the wrong direction. And I think that's actually one of the things that bothers me about our obsession with optimization. It's not that optimization is bad. You can optimize some things and they can become useful, of course. The problem is that you have to know what you're optimizing for. Otherwise, what are you actually doing? And I think this is where the hierarchy comes in. Because the problem with modern society isn't that we've decided that money is good or that work is good. Those things can genuinely be good. The problem is that we've allowed some of these things to move higher and higher in the hierarchy until they start determining the value of everything else. And I think once this thing is happening, the relationship gets reversed. Work is supposed to serve life, but life starts serving work. And we can say the same thing about money and productivity. And I think you can even see this is the way we think about leisure. We often justify relaxing by saying that we need to recover so that we can become more productive again. And obviously that's true sometimes, but to justify it every time, that seems to be wrong to me. It's just the hierarchy there it's all messed up. But what if some things are valuable simply because they're part of a good human life? And I think once you start looking at life this way, you realize how much of modern society is built around this idea of usefulness. We constantly ask, what is this useful for? And that's a good question to ask when we are talking about a piece of technology or a business decision. But can we really use that question to understand the entire human life? Because if you do that, eventually everything becomes instrumental. You work so that you can make money. You make money so that you can have a good life. You rest so that you can work better. You exercise so that you can become more productive, and so on. And I'm not saying that any of these individual things are wrong. I'm saying that if everything is being justified by what it's producing for something else, then eventually you have to ask whether there's anything in our life that we actually consider valuable in itself. And then we get to the difficult part. Because once you accept that there is some kind of hierarchy of values, then you have to ask what actually belongs at the top. And this is where the question gets much harder. It's easy to say, well, family is more important than money, or friendship more important than, I don't know, career. And yeah, okay, but why? Why should family be above money? Why should friendship be above status? And if you keep asking this question, or rather these questions, eventually you get to something that can't simply be another means towards something else. We need some kind of ultimate good. And this is where I want to leave it. We need to think about the ultimate good, what that is. How do we think about it? And how do we order our lives in such a way that we reflect this truth? So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you guys think about the ultimate good should be. See you there, and yeah, thank you for watching. See you in the next one.